Why are people resistant to the idea that DNA has a powerful influence on our personality and our behaviour?
I think in part people are resistant to the notion of the importance of genetics because they don't understand it. And that's one of the reasons I wrote my book, Blueprint, How DNA Makes Us Who We Are. But actually, I find there's much more resistance in the media than there is in the public. I've given probably 30 talks to fairly large public groups. And it's amazing to me that I hardly ever run into hostility. Mostly what I run into is people saying, I didn't know about that. That sounds really cool. And the data sound impressive. And people don't have a hard time accepting that inherited DNA differences are an important answer to the question of what makes us who we are. It doesn't explain everything by any means, but the point of my book is that inherited DNA differences is the major systematic force making us who we are as individuals, our personality, our mental health and illness, and our cognitive abilities and disabilities. These same genetic data provide the best evidence we have for the importance of the environment, but the environment works very differently from the way we thought it worked. And we can go into that in a bit.
Can we talk in more detail about how genetics affects your behaviour in the ways that you were saying?
Yes. There's so many background issues to talking about genetic influences on behavioral traits. And one place that I think is important to start is with the idea of genes as destiny. I gave a philosophical evening conversation last night on the topic of, do genes control our destiny? Because you say genes, and people think of hardwired puppeteers making us do things, deterministic. And part of that's because we learn about genetics from Mendel. And Mendel, if you remember, did experiments with pea plants, and he was essentially studying single gene mutations in pea plants. If you were a pea plant, you like your seeds to be nice and round and smooth. There's a mutation, a single gene mutation that causes them to be wrinkled. So that these single gene mutations are deterministic and hardwired and necessary and sufficient. For humans, there are maybe 7,000 to 8,000 single gene disorders. Most of them, thankfully, are very rare. But if you had one of these, like on the tip of chromosome 4, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, the tip of chromosome 4 has a gene that if you receive the mutated version of it, you have Huntington's disease, which is a neurological degeneration that happens later in life. And if you have that mutation, you will die from Huntington's. It doesn't matter what your environment is, your exercise regime, your food, it will kill you. It's necessary and sufficient. And so those are very important for the people who get them. But what we've learned in the last decade is that that's not where most of the genetic influence comes from for complex traits like those we study in psychology and common disorders like in medicine, heart disease, obesity, diabetes, for example. There's strong genetic influence, but there's no evidence for major gene effects. That is, any one bit of DNA is making a huge difference. What it's about, this heritability, is about thousands of tiny DNA differences that together have an impact on a disorder. So that's a whole new ballgame. Single gene genetics would be rather simple. You just find the gene, you find out what it does wrong, and you try to change it, although we're not very good at doing those things. But here, we've got thousands of little DNA differences that are making you predisposed, say, to schizophrenia, or in my case, to obesity. And it makes it go from a deterministic, hardwired, single gene concept to a probabilistic propensity. And that's what's hard for people to understand. So if I say you have a 15, well, in my case, we put these thousands of DNA differences together and we call them polygenic scores. My highest risk polygenic score is for body mass index, weight. So my genetic score, just looking at my DNA alone, it says I'm about at the 94th percentile for weight. My actual weight is at the 70th percentile. So I'm still, borderline obese, but, this raises a lot of issues about destiny. It doesn't mean I'm I throw up my hands and say, oh, well, I'm a genetic fatty, nothing I can do about it, which is what people worry about. Instead, I find it very motivating because I know it's not destiny. If I don't eat, I won't gain weight. And thin people like, many people in the audience will just say, well, get a grip, little self-control here, don't eat so much. But people who, like me, have this propensity to put on weight, and we don't really respond to food cues in the same way, and there's this sense of satiety that psychologists talk about. That is, if you're full, you probably stop eating. And I sort of say at dinner, I'm out with friends, I'm full, I don't want any more. But if there's food left on the table, as we're talking, before you know it, I've eaten most of that food. Even though I wasn't hungry particularly, it's just I don't have the same sense of, oh, I'm full, I absolutely don't want anything more. And the other thing is sensitivity to food cues. When we're bombarded by food cues, easy enough to say, well, just get a grip, resist those things. But I can't walk past a pastry shop, for example. The smells, my mouth is watering just thinking about it, So we need to respect these differences. And obesity is a great example because there's this stuff going on about food, fat shaming, people even suggesting that on the NHS, if you go in for an obesity-related disorder like diabetes or cardiovascular disease, why should the society pay for it? Because it's your problem. Well, one answer to that is we pay for lung cancer treatment for people who've smoked cigarettes all their life, and that's a lot, I would say, because I don't smoke probably. That would be an easier thing to resist. But, people need to know that, and I bet this will surprise people, that individual differences in body mass index, which is weight corrected for height, is about between 60 and 70%. That means of the differences between people that are so apparent in their weight, almost 2/3 of those differences can be ascribed to inherited DNA differences that came from that first cell with which you were born. And that's the cool thing about DNA, is it doesn't change during your lifespan. Those inherited DNA differences that were formed uniquely by the egg and the sperm that created your first zygote, that same DNA is in every one of the trillions of cells in your body. There are some mutations you pick up along the way, but the systematic influences of heredity are there in that first zygote. So that makes DNA an incredible predictor because there's nothing else we have that allows you to predict from early in life. And this is why medicine is so keen on this. This is why the NHS is talking about making DNA testing available for everyone. Because medicine, there's two big movements in medicine. One is preventive medicine, and that's the idea of instead of waiting for people to have a heart attack and then trying to fix it. And it's said that a severe heart attack costs 700,000 pounds all in. There's a lot of treatment afterwards and all that, let alone the personal suffering and the reduction in quality of life. So waiting until something happens and then trying to cure it is expensive and it's painful. If you could prevent that heart attack from occurring, it just is a no-brainer because you save all that money, you save all that pain. And so to prevent, you need to predict. And DNA is the best predictor we have from early in life. I mean, sure, you could say, because I'm overweight, because I'm a male, because I'm over 60, I'm at, on average, greater risk for having a heart attack. But that doesn't give you much power in predicting that I'm going to have a heart attack. What's cool about DNA is it makes a specific genetic prediction for me, knowing nothing else about these other characteristics. And what's great about it with cardiovascular disease is there's lots of things you can do to prevent heart attacks. I mean, for one, the lowest tech solution is to pay attention to the messages we all receive. Eat well, exercise, those sorts of things, but we all kind of ignore that. If you knew you were at very high risk, though, for heart attack, you would pay more attention to it. Then you can go higher up in the tech ladder and think about more frequent sorts of assays, to make sure your arteries aren't clogging too much. And there are now these whole body scans, so you can do more and more expensive things that you can't do for everybody. But if you can identify people at very high risk, it seems to be the way to go to prevent. And then the other thing, so the first movement in medicine is preventative medicine. And psychology is trying to do this too, moving away from waiting until you have a problem, like obesity or alcoholism. They're very hard to fix once you've really had them. Better to prevent them. And alcoholism is a great example because you cannot become alcoholic unless you drink a whole lot of alcohol over a long period of time. So that's really great for prevention. But the other major trend in medicine is what some people call personalized medicine, or in the US, they call it precision medicine. So instead of giving drugs on a one-size-fits-all basis, surely it has to be better to say that people with this genetic profile would profit more from that drug or that dose. And this is probably going to drive it even more. There is always people with any drug that it really has negative effects on them. And so if you could identify people who will have a negative effect, a negative side effect of this drug, and you know it's not going to work for them, you don't administer it to them. So prevention and personalized medicine are the reason why medicine is so excited about this. And Estonia and Finland already make DNA testing available to anyone who wants it. If you go in the hospital and they take blood, they say, would you like to have us do this DNA testing? And we'll tell you you've got risks for things that we can do something about. And 85% of the people say, yes, please, I'd like to do that. And the NHS, Matt Hadcock, wants to do this. And it hasn't happened yet. And with all Corona and Brexit and everything else, I don't know when it's actually going to happen. But there has been 150 million set aside to do this on a trial basis, to get it going with a few million people. So I find it tremendously exciting. And I've been emphasizing the positive aspects of this. And partly that's because so many people are saying, the sky's going to fall if we do these things. It's terrible. There's identity issues. There's labeling issues. If you knew you had a risk for alcoholism, would that mean, people think it means you're going to say, oh, well, I'm going to be alcoholic. But, I never see that. I see when you identify a risk for someone, they might not do anything about it, but they're more likely to say, yeah, I'm going to pay a little bit more attention to this, and I think that's the way it's going to work at that low-tech level of information. That's why 25 million people in the world have paid about £100 to get this DNA testing, because they want to know about their risk for things. They also want to know about their ancestry and all of that. So I think it's really transformational, and I'm tremendously excited about it. But what I started to say was there's plenty of people who worry about it, the doom mongers, I call them. And, that's really unfair. There's a lot of things we need to worry about. What about, AI getting a hold of our genetic information? What about insurance companies knowing that you have a high cardiovascular risk? They're going to say, they're going to do their best not to insure you, or if they insure you, they're going to say, this is going to cost you a lot of money. The insurance companies worry about, well, if you knew you were at heart attack risk and you didn't tell them, this is all illegal. They're not supposed to use genetic information. You're not either, because if you knew it was genetic, it's like a pre-existing condition. It would be illegal not to tell them, but this is going to happen. Both of these things will happen. And then the insurance companies would have to pay out, for people who took a lot of insurance to cover their risk. But I think the larger story here is, I don't see how the insurance industry is going to survive the DNA revolution. And I think this is the salvation of the NHS. Because the only way to get by with the DNA information is to spread that risk, and to have institutions like NICE, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, who says, we start with you can't do everything for everybody. So you've got to ration resources. And you say, in our research, this suggests it's worthwhile. This particular drug, even if it's expensive, it really does improve quality of life. But these other drugs that, say, in terminal diseases, give you an extra month or so, and it's hugely expensive, they say, we can't really afford to do that for everybody. So I think spreading the risk is huge. That really does make it important. But the second thing that people don't realize is that with an insurance-based system, like in the US, hospitals get paid when they treat you for your disorder. they get paid when I have a heart attack and they have to fix my heart attack. They don't get paid if I don't have a heart attack. So there's nothing in it for them to try to prevent disorders. Whereas from a national health system, that it's a no-brainer. That's what you want to do. You want to prevent the disorders from happening. So I really do think, as well, COVID has really made people appreciate the NHS, but, it has been underfunded for a long time. And it's one of the jewels, in the UK. It's one of the things in the world people hold up as, there's an NHS system that really works for people at the point of entry. And being an American, I'm also a UK citizen, but in America, when people go for jobs, not just the lowest jobs, but up to the higher level management jobs, they're much more concerned about the healthcare benefits than they are about the salary. Because with Obama, 10% of the people were uninsured. It's now going up to 20%. And if Trump is reelected, it's going to be, 50%. I mean, they hate Obamacare because it's Obamacare, I think. But, it's such an amazing thing to do. But people without health insurance, they die. They have to be treated. If they were in an accident, they have to be treated to the point where they're stable. But then they don't get more treatment. So I just think when people think of the NHS as a throwback to the idealism of the post-World War, Second World War, and that's when all the big changes happen, and that's when Bevan decided that we should have universal health care. I think now people think, oh, that's kind of past its time. It's an old-fashioned idea. We need to have this be market-driven and capitalistic. And man, I don't want people making decisions about my health and my operations on a financial basis. And that's really what happens in the States. So I think this should be wonderful for the national health system. I hope it is.
Paint a picture for me. How would it work? How does it start to intervene in your life?
Yeah. Well, ideally, and this is what Matt Hancock is moving towards, everyone at birth has DNA testing. Because you only have to do it once. And once you've got those 3 billion base pairs, suppose some other genetic risk is discovered when they're 15. Maybe there's some drug that people have been taking that we always thought was okay, and suddenly it's not. And you've got to do something about that, especially with people who are genetically sensitive. So it opens up the possibility for the rest of your life of getting information that would be useful for you for preventing illness. So people say, oh my God, that's Gattaca. I don't know, you're too young, I think, to know the movie Gattaca.
I've seen it. I know. Know what you mean.
Well, that's older audiences. That's what they say. Oh gosh, that's like Gattaca. But people don't realize we've been DNA testing babies at birth for 50 years. And the reason that started was one of the first genes that was discovered, a single gene disorder, is called phenylketonuria. It causes severe mental retardation in less than 1% of the population. But PKU is a single gene recessive disorder. You need 2 doses of it. And when that was discovered, they realized it was a simple metabolic error. That's why it's called phenylketonuria. Phenylalanine. You have trouble breaking down phenylalanine. And what happens if you can't break it down is it builds up. And if it builds up in the developing brain in the first few years of life, it causes severe retardation. So much so that most PKU kids that aren't treated would need to be institutionalized. They can't take care of themselves. They don't talk. So it's very bad news. And by knowing, though, that it's this metabolic error, you could probably even figure out, well, if the problem is you can't break down phenylalanine, what if we eliminate phenylalanine from the diet? And it's mostly in red meats and milk products, and especially colostrum, breast milk. The early breast milk is really high in phenylalanine. By doing that simple nutritional intervention, you sidestep the problem. So, I mean, that was so brilliant, and that was in the 50s and 60s. Problem is, so that's a perfect example. You find the gene, you find out what's wrong, and it isn't a biological intervention. It's simply an environmental intervention. So that's brilliant. The problem is there aren't a lot of other examples like that. And partly that's because single gene disorders are so rare. And most of our big problem, the real medical burden and psychological burden in society, is with these complex traits and common disorders. Things like schizophrenia and reading disability and alcoholism and obesity and diabetes. So these are not things that are caused by a single gene. And if they're caused by thousands of little gene effects, it's unlikely you're going to get a silver bullet there that's just going to fix the problem.
You understand your inherited biology, your DNA, in order to get a sense of what you're more likely to be up against. But then it is up to your environmental situation and the decisions you make in your life to try and mitigate that. It's not just a case of biology is destiny.
No, absolutely not. Biology is destiny. It's informative. Like here's one tough example. If you do 23andMe, as say 10 million people have, it's the biggest of these. We call them direct-to-consumer DNA companies, DTC. And so it has about a third of the market, I would say. And one of the things you would find out if you did that is whether or not you're at risk for Alzheimer's. People know Alzheimer's dementia late in life. Now, at age 80, 10% of the people have at least the beginning stages of Alzheimer's, which can last for 15 years. So a lot of us will have it at the age of 10, at the age of 80, maybe 10% of the population. But if your results from 23andMe could tell you, if you're in the unlucky 1% of the population, that your risk won't be 10%, it will be 60%, 60%. Now that's not 100%, but as medical risks go, 60% is off the scale. I mean, that's a really high risk. So for that reason, about half of the people, including James Watson, who won the Nobel Prize for double helix, didn't want to know. And if you ask an audience, half of them will say, I don't want to know, it's going to ruin my life. There's nothing I can do about it now. But the other half, which includes me, is I always want to know. Information, knowledge is power and forewarned is forearmed. So even though we can't intervene to cure it now, that's the goal. You're not going to wait. You're not going to make people better who have Alzheimer's. What you hope to do is to prevent people from getting Alzheimer's. So by being able to predict genetically, you're much more likely to be able to find interventions that work. So I'm optimistic that something will be found before I'm reaching that age. It turns out I did the testing and I don't have that risk. So, but I mean, if I had that risk though, and I had to say, if you do it with 23andMe, you have to say, yes, I understand how, what a big deal this is, finding out about it. And then again, you have to say, yes, I've read about it. I really understand it. Yes, I want my results. And then you have to say again, yes, I want my results for this. Because they want to make sure people don't get those results unless they've thought about what this means. Because it could be devastating for people. And the worst bit about it is, in the end, if you are in that 1%, you get a link that says, you might want to find out more about this. Whereas you would hope if this were on the NHS, they would say, we've scheduled an appointment for you to come in to talk to somebody and maybe bring a close relative or something like that, But people do divide down the middle on this. And I would say, I want to know, because I think there is something you can do about it. That is, if I knew I was at a 60% risk for having Alzheimer's, I would first of all try to make sure economically I'm going to be okay, with care homes for elderly being shit. We need to maybe think more about protecting ourselves, but then also socially. I mean, you want to set up things with your family to make sure they understand. And, so I think there are things you could do. But for me, the biggest thing, I think, would be carpe diem. I'd say I need an extra dollop of, instead of thinking about, when I retire, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. I'd think a lot more about doing that stuff now. So it's a good example of it kind of ties together a number of the things that we've been talking about.
You mentioned at the start, when you talk to people, they're very receptive, but you feel like there's some sort of buffer or difficulty with the media. And I was wondering if you could just sort of expand on that and why it's hard for your message to necessarily be communicated in the way you want it to be.
Yeah, well, that's going to be my How the Light Gets In debate tomorrow, is with Yasmin Alibi-Brown, who's very much on the left, and Lord Matt Ridley, who, well, I won't make too much of a plug for it, but we're talking sort of about science and politics and genetics and should they get mixed up. But as Yasmin Alibi-Brown will say, the left has been associated with environment and the right has been associated with genetics. Now, I think that's incredibly simplistic and not true necessarily among friends I know. And so I would say, even if that were true, why is the environment good and genetics bad? More harm by far has been done in psychology from environmentalistic perspectives. When I was in graduate school in the 70s, in the textbooks, it would say, schizophrenia is caused by what your mother did to you in the first 3 years of life. Man, that is as wick as it could be, because you don't find out that they're schizophrenic till they're 20, in the late teens or early 20s. And then you're told it's because of what you did early in life, which you can't change. You can't go back in time and change that. I mean, environment does incredibly wicked things. And in parenting, which interests me a lot, it's mostly mother blaming. That's the way the environment works. Kids don't do well at school. They have mental health problems. It's basically the mother. And mother blaming is crazy because there's no evidence to support that. So I don't think the environment should be good necessarily, and I don't think genetics should be bad. Genetics can do a lot of good for us in terms of predicting problems and trying to prevent them before they occur with personalized medicine. Instead of giving kids with ADHD, hyperactivity, methylphenidate, an amphetamine, which is what they do in the States. 10% of the kids are getting this, and it's increasing in the UK. Well, if you knew that some kids would really profit from that and it won't hurt them, you could predict that genetically. Okay, maybe, but undoubtedly, some kids will actually be harmed by that. And so personalized medicine and prevention, I think, are so positive that for me, they outweigh the negatives, but I think we have to have this discussion. But what I don't like is this knee-jerk idea that if you're left, you have to deny genetic influence, which is really what it has been up to now. Just any sort of genetics was bad. And that's the way it was when I was in graduate school in the 70s. Genetics, schizophrenia is caused by what your mother does to you in the first few years of life. Genetics is not mentioned. Whereas now, we know genetics accounts for most of the differences between people and who becomes schizophrenic or not, and really how severe their schizophrenia is. I don't think there are many people now, even on the far left, who would say, oh no, schizophrenia is caused by what your mother did to you. I mean, I bet if we did a poll, most people would say, yeah, schizophrenia has a strong genetic component. And if you're a parent, you ought to be damn glad about that, because here you do the best for your kid. You're as good a parent as you can be. Everything's fine until late adolescence, when they start losing touch with reality. They're isolated, they don't have friends, and then eventually lose touch with reality. That's devastating. And if you really believe that you have molded your kid to be the way they are, you don't consider genetics, I don't see how you can sleep.
Fantastic.
For more debates, talks, and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.